welcome to episode 13 of Mythicast. I'm your host, Mike Greenbaum, and Mythicast is part of the Constructed Criticism Always Improving family. So you might be thinking this is a standard podcast and we should be talking about Oko, but we're not going to be doing that. We are not going to be doing a deck tech on Oko today. Instead, we're going to be talking about the deck that just might be well positioned in the meta to beat it. And I'm talking about blue-white control. And I can think of no better guest to talk about this deck with than our guest today, Jason Tams. Jason, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great, Jason. So, for those of you who don't know anything about Jason, Jason has probably gotten as close as you can get to qualifying for the Pro Tour without actually getting there. I'm sure we're going to get into that, even though it might be bringing up some painful memories.
Yeah.
But Jason loves these color pairs. He played Approach the Second Sun last year. He's been playing Blue-White Flyers over the summer, and now he's been trying to take Blue-White Control and his specific version on it to a Pro Tour qualification. Didn't quite get there this weekend, but we're going to talk all about the deck and just how well positioned it is. So, Jason, before we get into the deck, though, can you tell the viewers a little bit about you and when you started playing Magic the Gathering?
So I actually started during Tempest.
Okay.
And I had just moved to Texas, had met one friend. We moved to where we were a street over from him, so I started walking to his house, and him and his brother played Magic, and they gave me a grocery bag full of blue cards from Ice Age that were really, really bad. And I kept it in that grocery bag for as long as I possibly could. It was like 600 cards and like 12 islands. And it kind of never stopped.
Yeah, so I was going to bring up, a lot of people, myself included, you play a little bit of Magic when you're a kid, and then the cards go away. They go in the basement, they go in the closet, and 10, 15 years later, you pick them up. But for you, it was love at first sight? You never stopped once you started playing?
Yeah, I mean, I've pretty much played every card game you could possibly name. I even played this game that I think was like National Geographic released it. And it was so I've always loved card games, and Magic has just always been the best game. And I mean, I took, I've had like 3 or 4 months where I took a break, or going into my freshman year in high school, I took 6 months off. But really, I've never like following Magic, playing Magic, being involved with Magic. It just never stopped.
Okay, so you've never been stopping playing Magic, but at what point did you realize, you know what, this is more than just this casual hobby I like to do with my friends. This is something I want to take more seriously. I'm going to travel to events. I want to get to the highest levels. Was there a specific moment, or was it kind of a gradual over time thing?
Well, it kind of both. I wanted to get better because I kept losing, and I started playing at a local shop, and my 500 card deck wasn't good enough. And I showed up one day with a mono red deck playing main deck Boil because I didn't have enough red cards to make a 60 card deck, and I played against 3 blue decks that day, and the Boils were fantastic. And at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, there's like, you can think about this game and approach it from a certain way, and it became this giant puzzle. And at that point, I started subscribing to Inquest and Scry magazine, and I tried to convince my parents to take me to events. But I think really what did it for me was when I started driving and was able to drive myself to events, being able to travel on my own. That was really shortly after Kamigawa Block, Ravnica. That was when I started really like taking the game seriously.
Yeah, and that's awesome. And now though, you're a little bit older. We have family. I know you're a student at law school. Mm-hmm. So thinking about all these obligations, how do you balance Magic with it, in the sense that if you want to be this competitive top level player, because you're still traveling, not maybe as far, but you're playing in PTQs, you're going to, I think, GP Oklahoma City soon. So how do you balance that with your family obligations and school obligations while trying to be this high level player?
So it's a lot of support from my family. My wife is so incredibly supportive of me playing. She will take the kids out of the house for 6 hours to make sure that I have a quiet, a quiet environment to play. My kids are super supportive, and just knowing that the first time I was ever featured on stream, I text my wife the link, and her and my kids watched me play, and they were super into it. And at that moment, I knew that I had the support of my family, and that's really how I've been able to balance all of this. They keep me grounded. so I don't just blow off all my responsibilities. But they also they show a lot of support, and they help me always try a little bit harder, and they make the losses a little bit easier to bear because they're supportive. So that's kind of the balancing act, is just making sure that you have a good support network.
That's awesome. As the father of a very young daughter, married for a little over a year now, down the road, I'm kind of hoping the same thing with the sport with my wife and kids. So far, so good.
Yep.
But I know, as they get older, there's more obligations, and you really have to really carve out time for yourself to play the game. And that's awesome. You found that balance with your family. So when it comes to playing the game, you mentioned you have that quiet environment at home. Is that for testing or when you're playing Arena and Magic Online and big events?
So I usually try to test at a card shop when I'm testing for major events. I kind of like test for my playtesting sessions using Magic Arena or Magic Online. I'll play events on both. Arena is kind of something I've been able to just grind whenever I need to, just sit down and play a bunch of games. But then usually I like to sleeve up whatever decks I'm having success with and take them to a card shop where I'm just in an environment that is like a tournament type environment. I'm surrounded by, noises and distractions and whatnot. But when I'm playing digital Magic, I'm in an office, it's closed, it's quiet. My kids may come in, to say goodnight or, wake up in the middle of the night and ask how I'm doing. But it's, I shut the door and I focus on Magic.
That's awesome. And speaking of Magic Online, if you're looking to play not only standard, but all the great formats that Magic Online offers, we are lucky enough to be sponsored by a great website, mtgotraders.com, where you can get all your Magic the Gathering card needs, as well as their sister site, Pure MTGO, where you can get all of the latest and greatest news on Magic and all things related to the online world. But this is a Magic Arena podcast, so I want to talk a little bit about Arena because, interestingly enough, you haven't qualified to the Mythic ranks in the past couple months, but for the most part, you've lived in the Mythic ranks for the first few. So what's changed for you, Jason? Why no Mythic the past couple months?
So in August, I started law school, and law school is completely different than undergraduate, and I stopped having free time suddenly. It was like before school even started, they were like, oh, here's a bunch of work you have to do, and you're going to be up until all hours of the night, and you really, it's about training your brain to think different, and the reading that we have to do is completely different, and something had to go, and it wasn't going to be time with my family. So I decided I'm going to take a step back, got some advice from some lawyers in the Magic community, and they all said, look, take your first year of law school and let Magic take a back seat. So these last couple of months I really have just been messing around on ladder, trying out different things, but not really grinding towards Mythic because I don't have, the same amount of time that I did before to really just, grind out Golos mirrors. So
yeah, and I think that's something that maybe our viewers, if they're not aware, right? You don't have to get Mythic every single month, right? If you just want to qualify for the MCQWs, it's once in a 2 or 3 month period. And if you don't make it in that, even if you drop all the way down to bronze, right? If you're a good player, which a lot of our listeners are, you'll make it right back up to Mythic. It might take a little bit longer, but the way the system works, you kind of you fall into gold. And then once you hit gold, if your play will carry you through. So if our viewers, it's not one of those things where you miss Mythic once and then suddenly I'm done with Arena. It's, you don't make it 1 month. It's not a big deal. You go to gold, you go to silver, and you work your way right back up. But when we talk about grinding to Mythic, because you've done it a few times, how do you stay sane on the ladder? Because the ladder can drive you nuts. You have your winning in for Diamond or Mythic, you drop 2 or 3, suddenly you're in Platinum 3 or Platinum 2, and it feels like you're never going to get there. So how did you stay sane when grinding the ladder?
I'm really big into stats, which is kind of funny because I hate math, but I keep a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet, and I record my matches. And what that does is it always keeps me evaluating every game, every match that I play, draw, what happened, why did I lose, what was the tempo of the game, and it keeps me from going into that play again, that you lose or you win, play again, play again, play again, and it keeps me from falling into that rhythm where you start making the same play over and over and over again. You don't realize that it's a mistake, and it breaks up the monotony of the grind, I think, for me. And that really is just forcing myself to slow down just a little bit and evaluate every single match has been how I've been able to increase my win rate on ladder and make sure that I'm not, just rushing. Oh, I'm in my win and in. Let's play again. I really stop and evaluate. And that way, when I do play that win and in, I have had a chance to breathe for my last match, and I can go in with a little bit cooler head, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, even if it's just a 2-minute walk, just get up, walk around your apartment or house, wherever you are, just a deep breath or two, do something. It does make a world of difference because the ladder is a numbers game. Eventually with the volume, you'll probably rank up, but we're not looking to spend grinding 8 or 9 hours a day.
Right.
Most of us don't have the time to do that, whether it's family, school, or work. So you want to maximize your time. And even if you can squeeze in one extra match by not taking those breaks, if that match turns into a loss, it's undoing the progress anyway. So I think it's
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So for our viewers that are listening, make sure you are taking, even if it's a short break, even if it's a minute, just taking a breath, something before just mindlessly clicking into the next match. So when we talk about Magic, have you found that any of the skills from Magic have transferred over into your law school, whether it's study habits, analytical skills? Has anything from Magic kind of worked its way into that aspect of your life?
So actually, yes. Magic is a giant puzzle, like I said earlier, and you're always trying to figure out how this thing works with this other thing, and how does this rule interact with this rule. Well, law school is all about getting a case about a topic, and you have to read the case and you have to understand the case before your professor ever talks about the case. And from those cases, we're supposed to, pull certain things out. Well, if you look at any metagame, you need to pull out certain parts of the metagame. Okay, well, this is winning and this is why it's winning. Well, in law school, it's the same thing. This is why the case was this way. Here's the rule from it. And then going back and applying those things that you've learned and being able to just, I guess, use Magic, my experience in Magic of breaking down, I guess, how things interact with each other has really helped me understand the line of thinking that you have to have in law school. How does this case that seems almost identical to this other case, why are they different? Why did they have a different ruling? And a lot of people struggle with certain topics, but I have those are the topics that I'm best at because I'm used to having to find these little nuancey differences. Why are they playing main deck Veil this summer all of a sudden versus not playing main deck Veil? Like, what is the difference between these two cards and why one lets perform and one didn't?
Yeah, and when you are able to make these analytical decisions, like hopefully most of our viewers can, you're going to find yourself in Mythic. Even if you haven't made it there yet, eventually you're going to make it to Mythic. And Jason, when you hit Mythic, are you just trying to camp for top 1200? Or are you going for the top? What has your experience been like when you hit the top level of Mythic?
It kind of depends, actually. So if I've already got my qualification, I'm going for as high as I can possibly get. But if I haven't got my qualification, because of how detrimental like trying to shoot for that number one spot can be mentally, I'm really just trying to shoot for top 200-ish, and then letting myself camp there as long as possible. A good example is in June, I hit like 174 on a Thursday night and then didn't play Arena at all until after the reset, which was on a Sunday, because we had a GP in my hometown. So I was at the GP all day, every day. But because, my goal was to just hit as high as I possibly can in camp, when I hit 174-ish, I just was able to sit and let myself decay rather than trying to worry about number one. But if I already have the invite for the MCQW, I'm trying to get as high as I possibly can.
Okay. And what is the highest you've made it so far on the ladder? Have you hit that top 50, top 20, top 100?
I hit top 50. I was 48, I think.
Oh, nice.
And then I lost like 5 matches in a row. And I was just like, oh, okay, well, I do not like. I was playing the blue-green Nissa mass manipulation entrancing melody deck.
Yeah.
And I do not like these big ramp decks where you can draw half your deck and then no payoffs, or draw all the payoffs and no ramp. And it got me there, and then it also got me back down into the percentages. So
yeah, and that's something we talk about a lot on this podcast, where your rank is just a blip in time. If you're top 20, you're not the 20th best player in the world, and if you're in the low percentages, you're not that low either. It's just a blip in time, and the ladder is designed to make you go down when you're high up and decide to boost you up when you're low. It's just the nature of the ladder with pair downs and all that other stuff. So it's as awesome as it is to shoot for one, just keep in mind that if you're going for it, you need to maintain an unreasonably high win rate to get to the top 20, and then an even more unreasonably high win rate to get from the 20 to the top 10, the top 5. So while it's a great accomplishment for sure, just if you get to that top 50, just know that the grind from like 95% to 50 is shorter than the grind from 50 to 1.
Yep.
Which I found out the hard way when I hit 16, and then it was just you go up 1, and then you lose and you go down 50, and that's that. So the ladder is brutal, but I think people they love it because if there's something cool about saying I'm the best person playing this game right now, I'm number one, and I think that's what a lot of us are shooting for. And if you're listening to a podcast like this, that's something you're into. So if you're listening to a podcast like this, you want to know the latest tech. You want to know what you can do to get to those high ranks. And everything that needs to be said about Sultai Oko, Simic Oko, Bant Oko has been said. But we're going to talk today about a different deck. We're going to talk today about blue-white control. So for those of you listening and not watching this on YouTube, I'm going to quickly go through the deck. We'll read out the main deck 60, the sideboard 15, and we're going to talk about some of the card choices and why we think this deck right now is positioned to be a successful player in the meta. So as far as our cards, we have 4 Brazen Borrower, 2 Mass Manipulation, 2 Dovin's Veto, 4 Absorb, 4 Teferi Time Raveler, 4 Chemist's Insight, 4 Time Wipe, 2 Agent of Treachery, 3 Tail's End, 1 Gadwick the Wizened, 3 Prison Realm, 2 Castle Ardenvale, 2 Castle Vantress, 4 Fabled Passages, 4 Hollowed Fountains, 4 Plains, 4 Tranquil Coves, and 7 Islands. And then in our sideboard, we have 2 Disenchant, 2 Glass Casket, 2 Lesotop Plating, 2 Sorceress Spyglass, 2 Narset Parter of Veils, 2 Covetous Urge, okay, a Finale of Glory, a Dovin's Veto, and a Realm Cloak Giant. So there are a lot of cards here that I haven't seen anywhere else. And I know you like to tinker. You like to take a deck and then put a spin on it. And we're going to talk about some of these cards. So I've had some time to play with this deck. And I want to know, before we go into anything, why not play Oko? You had a PTQ this weekend. Why not just sleeve up Sultai Oko and just say, this is the best deck, I'm going to roll with it?
So every time we've ever had a tier 0 deck, there are two possibilities of that tier 0 deck. One, it's just so degenerate that it's whoever does their degenerate thing first is the one who wins the game. And two, the other way the format goes is whoever has the most experience in the mirror generally wins. They know what's important. They know how to manipulate the matchup in their favor. They know all the key lines and interactions, and that's why you see Brad Nelson always so successful, or Brian Bronduin always so successful when they're playing mirrors. It's because they know the interaction between the mirror better than anybody else in the world. I have not got to play a lot of Magic, so sitting down to play, a 7-round standard tournament, if I was playing Sultai Oko against people who've been playing Sultai Oko for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, I'm going to be at a disadvantage naturally. And whereas playing Sultai Oko against the random nonsense, I may be at an advantage. I expect to play Sultai Oko 3 or 4 times in a tournament. I'm not going to lose percentage points because I don't know what I'm doing. I'd rather play the deck that I have the most experience with, or a deck that targets that deck. I played Teamer Energy when it was the best deck because I started week 1 standard playing Teamer Energy, didn't stop playing it. It's not the case with Sultai Oko, so I wanted to put myself in the best position to win, and that was play something that wasn't a bunch of mirrors all day.
Okay. So I've had a chance to sit down with your list, and I think we have to start by talking about Tail's End, because that is a card that when you're playing, especially on the ladder, people are not expecting it. They are playing their matches where they are setting up lines where that card is not a factor. So how did you arrive on Tail's End? Because I've been talking with you for a while about this deck, and that was the card from the get-go you wanted to play. So why Tail's End? Where does it win you matches? What does it replace that most people are playing otherwise? So tell me about Tail's End.
So Tail's End really is kind of like Counterspell with upside right now. It counters, first of all, it counters Oko, just straight up counters it because it counters, it's a legendary. Mm-hmm. It also counters Nissa, it counters Questing Beast, But I think most importantly is it counters the Krasis draw and life gain trigger, which is very important because a lot of times you can counter the Krasis, but when they draw 3 or 4 cards, suddenly you haven't run them out of resources, which is exactly what these control decks are trying to do. Run their opponent out of resources, turn the corner, and go from there. But Krasis is that big catch up, and it lets these mid-range decks go over the top of the control deck. But if you have this counter, the triggered ability of Tail's End, you're kind of you're able to stop that from happening. But then it also has this other like bonus feature of I can counter all the legendary permanents, and everybody has planeswalkers right now. Everybody has, all the green decks are playing Questing Beast, or you see a lot of Rankle, or just all of these different legendary spells, and Tail's End counters them just straight up before they ever hit the battlefield.
Yeah. Does Tail's End counter mana abilities? Like if someone wants to sacrifice a Fabled Passage because they're counting on getting that 5th land for a time wipe, can you just basically lock them out and make that Fabled Passage go away?
Yep, absolutely. It actually happened at the PTQ this weekend. My opponent cast his Rankle off of 1 Black Source and a Paradise Druid. I bounced it with my Brazen Borrower. The next turn I got to untap and cast a Time Wipe, leaving 2 open mana. My opponent drew his card, played his land for turn. It was a Fabled Passage. He immediately put it into his graveyard and went to go search his library, but I Tails Ended, which let me lock him out of Rankle for that turn. My opponent's now at 3 lands, has nothing to play. He's got a Rankle and a blank in his hand. It turns out at the end of the game it was double Rankle. He couldn't cast either one of them because he only had 1 Black Source.
Yeah, so a very powerful card, and I think the Krasis trigger being countered is by far probably the most impactful use of that card.
Yep.
Especially when your opponent's not ready for it, which
Exactly.
I don't think anyone is. I think, if I'm not mistaken, recently at the GP in Japan, I think it was either the winning or second place list had a Tail's End in it. And I'm wondering if that technology is going to catch on, if this deck catches on, which we'll see at the PT. So another card that I've seen some people have on the sideboard, not the main deck, is Prison Realm. So of all the different removal spells for permanents, why Prison Realm?
It's white, and that's super important right now. It doesn't get countered by Veil of Summer, which is super important. And again, it hits Oko. It hits creatures. It's really good when you cast it on their 6/6 Krasis, and then you bounce it with your Teferi, because the Krasis goes away, you still have this removal spell. The versatility of having this white removal spell is that can hit planeswalkers and creatures, and it only costs 3 mana, is actually very significant in a format that's being dominated by these green-based mid-range decks that are playing, trying to max out on Veil of Summer after sideboard.
Yeah, so you mentioned the word sideboard, and I'm starting to think a lot of people at this point, if they're bringing a deck to a tournament, they're almost pre-boarding for Oko. So would you say your deck is pre-boarded for Oko, or do you still respect the field enough where you want to have some cards for the Oko matchup in the sideboard?
So the only card that I really have in the sideboard for Oko, just straight up, is Spyglass. And Spyglass is very good, and it's very versatile, but I don't really want Spyglass against the adventure decks, and people just aren't transitioning all the way to Oko. So I can't really justify having cards like Spyglass in my main deck that are kind of blanks against these adventure decks. So that's really the only card in my sideboard, but otherwise I'm pretty much main boarded against Oko.
Yeah, and I think that's been a theme lately, that Oko is just so prevalent that you really need to have some main deck answers. And we've seen with the Noxious Grasp and the Veils main now, it's just, that deck is just everywhere. So if you're not having a solid game 1 plan for that deck, you're definitely doing yourself a disservice. So when you play this deck game 1, how have you found yourself winning the most? Is it off stealing stuff? Is it off just castle triggers over and over by creating 1/1s? What do you do to win game 1 usually?
Honestly, it's like casting a Brazen Borrower and just protecting it and just killing my opponent from there. Won a lot of games at the PTQ where I just bounced my opponent's turn 1. They play a Goose, they get a food token, I bounce it with the Borrower. On turn 3, I'm casting the Borrower, and I'm just trying to hope that Borrower gets in for 12 points of damage, and then I'll cast another one and do it that way. Or I'll cast a Gadwick, tap down their squad, and then go from there. So Agent of Treachery goes big. Anytime the match goes long, it's Agent. Agent of Treachery wins games. But really, it's Borrower and cross your fingers.
Yeah. And have you found that you've been using Borrower to kind of tempo them out by taking away mana producing creatures like a tap down Paradise Druid or a Goose? Is that usually what the Borrow is early on, just trying to get you ahead on tempo?
Absolutely, yeah. Bouncing, they're like keeping them from casting the turn 3 Nissa, or bouncing the food token so they can't cast their turn 2 Oko, has been very effective as a way to allow myself to get to turn 4 to 5 to 6, where I'm able to start casting 2 spells a turn or a Teferi, and then having Tails End up. Um, Borrower has just been a superstar in pretty much every matchup. It's just been the tempo advantage from it is unrivaled, I think, in standard right now.
Yeah, and I'm looking at your list, and we talked about the Tails End, but I think the card that you might have had a cut on is Dovin's Veto. I've seen a lot of people running 4 Dovin's Veto and having Mystical Disputes on top of that. So have you found that only running 6 main deck counterspells has been detrimental to winning matches, or have you found that, because I know Tails End is a counterspell for certain cards, but have you found that not having the full complement of vetoes and disputes has been a detriment, or has Tails End been pulling its weight enough?
So the one regret I have from this weekend is not having any copies of Mystical Dispute in my 75. And I actually came to that conclusion, and I think it was one of those not enough games, small sample size, but I found that my Mystical Disputes were often very dead. I was playing against a lot of Jeskai Fires in preparation for this event, and I was just like, Mystical Dispute just isn't fantastic when they have a Fires in play, and I really didn't want access to Fire or to Mystical Dispute, so that's what I cut for the Tails End. And I cut from the list that I started with, I cut a Veto, and I cut the 2 Mystical Disputes for the 3 Tails End. I don't regret going down to 2 Veto. As good as Veto is, it doesn't counter Wicked Wolf, which is a problem. I do regret not having at least 1 or 2 Mystical Disputes in the main deck, and that's definitely a change I'd make going forward, probably.
Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about with the main deck is the mana base. It looks like a fairly stock mana base. Did you run into any troubles in terms of being able to cast your spells as far as color goes? Or did it basically, you kind of just mulligan until you had a reasonable 2 or 3 lander and kind of just went from there? Everything felt smooth.
So I didn't have a lot of issues getting my colors.
Okay.
The biggest issue I had was when you have the opener and it's Tapland and then Vantress, and then you can't really sequence your lands correctly to cast that turn 3 Absorb or the turn 3 Teferi, and you have to start making a decision. Do I want to hold up turn 2 Tails End or Veto? Do I want to try to turn 2 Borrower? And if I do, that means I'm not casting anything on turn 3, and that has been the biggest issue, which my original list I was going to run was playing 3 Castle Vantress, and I ended up going with a 7th Island instead, and I'm very grateful that I did that. You do have a lot of tap lands.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about game 1, and then when I look at your sideboard, there are a lot of cards here I haven't seen, not just in this deck, but in standard period. So you're a very creative deck builder, and every card here, I'm sure, has a specific purpose it serves. So let's start talking about the Lesotop plating. Can you let us know what that card does and what purpose does it serve in your sideboard?
So that card is kind of like the blue-white controls version of Veil of Summer. It gives you and permanents you control hexproof. The reason it's important is because going into this weekend, I'd heard from some people in the local area that Wilderness Reclamation was going to pick up, and then I'd seen it a bunch on Ladder, and then Jerry and Brian talked on their podcast about how Reclamation was the deck to play for the weekend, and Reclamation has the same issue that all the green decks do right now, and they get to play Veil of Summer. Well, if they're not playing Veil's main deck, you can counter it with Dovin's Veto. But if they're playing Veils in the sideboard, you can't really veto their expansion explosion. But you can cast Lazotep plating, and the Lazotep plating is going to keep you from dying to that to the expansion explosion. It also has this weird upside of being very good against green-black adventures. They can't Assassin's Trophy your permanents. The questing beast can't actually target your Teferi. It actually makes a blocker, which is super good sometimes when they're not expecting you to have a flash blocker because it has a mass 1. So it has this weird upside of also being good in that matchup. And then it's also good against the mono red decks that always show up in Texas.
Yeah, and I think every tournament always has that one or two mono red deck that someone just wants to, play burn in standards tile deck.
Yep.
So when we look at Disenchant, is that for fires? Is that kind of the?
That was actually where it started, and then with Reclamation picking up, it just was an added bonus. And then I also bring it in the mirror to deal with Prison Realm.
Oh, okay, that is pretty reasonable. Glass Casket, is that for the adventure decks, kind of these small creatures like Edgewall that just kind of can snowball a game?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about Spyglass. Let's talk about Covetous Urge. Because that card, I don't think I've seen anywhere. Can you tell us about that card and how it found its way into your 75?
So the control mirrors, oftentimes when there's black cards involved, come down to discard. It's who had the turn 2 Thought Erasure, or who had the most duresses. So this card, it's 4 blue or black hybrid, and it says, look, your opponent reveals their hand. You choose a card from their hand or their graveyard, and you exile it. And as long as it remains in exile, you can cast it and your mana taps for any color. So it's kind of like blue-white control's version of Thought Erasure. It's not quite as powerful as Thought Erasure because you can't cast it on turn 2, but it's also way more powerful than Thought Erasure because you get to cast whatever you take with it. And I wanted something for the mirror, and I wanted something for some of these mid-range decks that might show up. People who are hard targeting Oko in their own way, and then I stumbled across Covetous Urge on accident almost, when I was just looking at all the blue cards on Arena and showed up, and I read it and I was like, oh man, now I have access to a discard spell, and why should blue-white ever have access to a discard spell? But there it was, and it was fantastic every time it resolved. So
I mean, that's reasonable. And again, these are the type of things that you get percentage points against your opponent when they're just not expecting a discard spell. They have that one card in hand and they think, all right, well, this card's safe. I'm playing blue-white control, and then it's not only not safe, now you can cast it, which is awesome.
Yep.
So when I look at Finale of Glory, I've seen that card main decked a lot in blue-white control. So why did you decide not to have it in your main 60? And why, if it's not in your 60, why did you think it was a good sideboard addition?
I'm sorry, which card?
Finale of Glory.
Oh, Finale of Glory.
Yeah.
Finale of Glory is like the hardest card to evaluate in this deck, I think. And the reason why is a lot of times you're casting it for not nearly enough, and it's more like a fog than anything else. But then when you do finally cast it to win the game, it's fantastic. But it works best when you have gone very, very late and you have a Teferi in play, because you can do it at the end of your opponent's turn and then you can kill them.
So it's like
one of those cards.
It's like Scape Shift.
It's like Scape Shift. But I never wanted to have it early in the game, and especially game 1 when you're so far, when you've built your deck in a certain way to have a certain to target Oko in a certain way. Drawing that card early can actually just lose you the game. So I really wanted it. I definitely wanted it in the sideboard for the mirror, where you really don't want a lot of time wipes, if any, post board. And I definitely knew that I wanted it for some of the mid-range matchups where, just making 6 or 7 blockers was going to be not only enough, but also oftentimes would allow me to make 6 or 7 attackers at instant speed at the end of my opponent's turn. So I really did want a way to also, and then I also wanted like a way to win games where maybe there wasn't very much time left on the clock and I needed to just get a win very quickly.
Okay, so last thing I want to talk about as far as the deck goes is when you sat down for your first round of the PTQ, what deck were you hoping to face across the table? It has to be Oko, right? If you're bringing a deck, right? So I think that's something that if you're not bringing a deck right now that is designed to beat Oko, you probably shouldn't be playing it. If you're bringing
Right.
some deck, it's like, oh, well, if I just fade Oko for a few rounds, I'll be good. That's probably not what you want to be doing in Standard right now. So how many times did you face Oko in the tournament?
3 times.
Out
I've
of how
faced
many
Oko 3
matches?
times. 7 matches.
Okay, so
Actually,
that's...
I guess technically I played it 4 times. My round one opponent was playing Oko, but they were playing like Oko Vanifar, and their Oko wasn't nearly as effective as a normal Oko deck, so I don't really count it as Oko.
Yeah. And I think Oko is going to be something you're going to play about 50% of the time. And if you make it to those winners tables early on, it's probably going to get higher than that. Now, I know a lot of people are sick and tired of Oko and they don't like these tier 0 deck type formats. But something tells me you enjoy trying to brew to beat a tier 0 deck. Is that correct?
Yeah, I love tier 0. If I know that I'm going to play a deck 50% of a tournament, then that puts me at an advantage. I can sit down and figure out either what is the way to break the mirror early in the format. So I know we had talked when Simic Food had just done very well at the MC. We were like, well, Sultai's clearly the next step, right? Well, that everyone picked up on it. It wasn't a secret for very long. When Teamer Energy was the best deck, I played 6-mana blue Jace Planeswalker from the Planeswalker deck because I could attack with my Glorybringers and then untap them and then block with them. I could exert them every turn. So just finding ways to, I guess, make the mirror match better for you. But then once you've evolved to that point where the metagame is super, super inbred, you can find ways to either punish your opponent for playing, main deck Noxious Grasps, or you can hard target the deck. And if you're playing against it 50% of the time, then you really only have to worry about the other 50% of your matchups. And if your deck is just naturally good anyway, then you should, typically be doing very well at your tournaments.
So speaking of tournaments, right, we have a pretty big one coming up in a couple weeks. We have the Mythic Championship 6,
Yep.
which is a standard tournament. Do you think that this deck has a chance to make a big showing, or do you think it's going to be the Oko show?
I think it's going to be the Oko show. I think not playing Oko in that tournament, if you have devoted enough time to playing Oko, is probably a mistake, unless you're, Gabriel Nassif, and then, you should just be playing blue-white in every format, always. But no, I think there will be blue-white. I think there will be Wilderness Reclamation. I think there will be all flavors of Oko, and I definitely think we'll see these adventure decks. But I would be shocked if Oko wasn't just far and away the most played deck.
Okay, and then that leads to my next question. Monday, November 18th, it's time to put your kids to bed. Is Oko still a legal card in Standard?
Yes.
Yes. Is anything else illegal in Standard that isn't Field of the Dead?
Maybe Veil of Summer. I think.
So why not Oko? What do you think about Oko keeps it in the format?
So, one, if we compare this to previous, omnipresent cards like Smuggler's Copter, they waited until the new set was about to come out before they banned Smuggler's Copter. So history shows they are usually willing to err on the side of patience. We just had two GPs where, yes, food was super, super dominant, but at those GPs we had breakout decks, as their coverage likes to show. So, if we have an opportunity to wait and see, then I think they're going to want to wait and see. And if we get rid of some of these cards that allow Oko to, like Veil of Summer, which is an egregious mistake, like green should not have the best counterspell. If you get rid of these cards that keep Oko from just beating on aggro decks, because that's what Oko is supposed to do, beat on aggro decks, but then also just be better than the control decks, we might see a format evolve to where you have aggro decks that can exist because the control decks can beat Oko. Oko will beat the aggro decks will beat the control decks, and maybe we come to some sort of balance where, yes, food is still the dominant deck, but you can play other things and be perfectly reasonable. I think we're almost there now. We're like one or two, like maybe one card from the Oko deck away from being able to live in a world where Oko exists and other decks exist as well.
Okay, so kind of to pivot a little bit, I always find this topic interesting because there's a lot of different thoughts in it. What are your thoughts on 1-mana dorks? Like Llanowar Elves, Goose? Because I know for me, I don't think that a 1-mana dork going into a powerful 3-mana creature on turn 2 on the play is conducive for positive gameplay. But I know some people really enjoy that style of ramp. So where do you fall on the 1-mana dork spectrum?
Man.
It's a loaded question, I know.
Yeah. So I think 1-mana dorks are super bad in standard formats when we have things like Shocklands. Being able to go in the last format was the perfect example I can give was going turn 1 Lana Rolf into turn 2 Teferi into turn 3 anything into turn 4 Nissa. Like the game was over. There was nothing you could do if you were on the play and that's what you did. Game was over. And it was made possible because we had fantastic mana, and it was just like, why is that a thing that we are dealing with in standard, especially when we're given these super powerful planeswalkers. I think when you have a format that is slower, we don't have like super oppressive 3-mana planeswalkers. Maybe the best thing you're doing is going Llanowar Elf into a super powerful 3-drop creature that can be hit with a removal spell because a removal is really good. Then maybe 1-mana dorks are fine. I just don't know that I think Wizards is able to predict their formats well enough right now that they should be allowed to make 1-mana dorks until they can predict their formats a little bit better.
Yeah, makes sense to me. That is a pretty reasonable take, and I'm curious to see if when we see the preview season coming out for Theros, will there be some sort of 1-mana creature, or will they let the goose kind of run loose on its own? Only time will tell. But Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show. So Jason, if people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on social media? If you're streaming, let us know where we could look out for you.
Okay, so my Twitter is JTamsMagic. So JTAMS Magic, MAGIC. And that's my Twitter. And I do tweet about Magic a lot. I retweet about Magic a lot. And when I do stream, I tweet from my Twitter that I am streaming. And you can catch me streaming at Gamester2488. That's GAMESTER 2488. And I haven't streamed this semester. I spent a bunch of time over the summer streaming. And now that law school's starting to slow down, I plan on starting to stream again, probably over winter break and then all through next semester.
That's awesome, Jason. I'm looking forward to it, to see what blue-white concoction you cook up for us to watch on stream. Everyone, again, thank you so much for listening to episode 13 of Mythicast. As always, we are part of the Constructed Criticism, Always Improving family. And whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us in the audio version, you could always find us on all of your podcast platforms and on YouTube. Jason, thank you so much again. Next week, we have a great episode for everyone. We have Jeff Pika talking about what people have been calling Pika ponies, his Jeskai Fires horses deck, and I can't wait for that episode as well. Jason, thank you again, and have a great night, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.